Hey guys, Miss Rix here. In our last video, we talked about populations and what changes populations and what affects the different changes in populations versus developed and developing countries. So in this video, we're going to talk about different life expectancies in different countries, whether they are developed or developing. We're also going to talk about the transition between a developing and a developed nation. So first we'll talk about life expectancy. Here you can see this graph of life expectancy, and you can see pretty clear signs of developing nations or the least developed nations, and then developed nations or the most developed nations here in the yellow. Um, so these are all projected, but we are in 2015 here. So our average life expectancy is about 78 years, whereas in a less developing country, um, the average life expectancy is about 52 years. Now keep in mind that the biggest impact on this graph is going to be infant mortality rates. So the more developed your country is, the less infant mortality rates there are. So if you survive past that, um, you are more likely to obviously live longer, and you may live to an older age than what is depicted on this graph. So demographic transitions. So demographic transitions are the general pattern of change from high birth and death rates to lower birth and death rates, and they can happen in stages. So we're going to talk about those different stages. Um, Basically, industrial development is going to cause economic and social progress, and then it'll affect population growth. So we're not going to change population growth and then that's going to help our economy necessarily. It's going to be a cause and effect relationship. So let's start with the first stages. So the first stage of this transition is the birth and death rates are both high. This is a pre-industrialized nation, so their main economy is agricultural. So remember when we talked about agricultural economies, they have lots of children in these developing nations. They have lots of children because they need help with this agricultural economy within their families. They also have lots of children because not many of them are expected to live past infancy. So those are two main reasons why the birth rate is so high. So in this first stage, the population size is stable because even though they're having a lot more babies, they're also having a much higher death rate. So in the second stage, the birth and death rate is not so stable. So that replacement level is the exponential growth past the replacement level is much higher. So you can see here, this is kind of a second stage of population growth. We have a population explosion. So we're still having a lot of babies, but the death rate is declining because we're getting better hygiene, better healthcare, better education. Those are starting to change the climate of the developing nation. So birth rates are still going to remain high, but the death rates are going to be much lower. So we're going to have an exponential growth in the second stage. So then we go to the third stage. Population is slower because the birth rates decrease. So we have more education, particularly education of women, right? And the population size is going to stabilize closer to the replacement birth level. But the population is much higher, so we are starting to stabilize here instead of here. So it's still a high population size, but it's starting to transition and decrease. The fourth stage, the birth rate is going to drop below the replacement level, and the population is going to begin to decrease. So this takes multiple generations in order to transition to this stage of going from developing nation to a more developed nation. So what's going to have the biggest effect on transforming to through these stages? It's going to be education of women. So women and fertility are the biggest factor, or the most clearly related factor to these decline in birth rates. So increasing education and economic independence for women. In the demographic transition model, the lower death rate of the second stage is usually the result of increased levels of education. Educated women find that they don't need to bear as many children to ensure that some will survive. So, like we talked about in the developing nation, they had lots of babies for economic reasons. They had lots of babies uh, to ensure that some of them would survive. So, if they're not having to worry about either one of these things as much, then they're going to have less babies. Um, Instead of babies being contributing members of the family, they're going to become more of a detriment, because as women are working, it's harder to economically take care of multiple children. So that's going to have an effect on the birth rate. Women are able to contribute to their families' increased prosperity. So they're going to spend less energy caring for children, more energy helping their economic growth of their family. Okay, so for this video, we're going to stop here and make sure to go back. You can rewind whenever you would like. Make sure you're taking notes and taking the quiz on our Google Classroom.